begin, however, by taking a little bit of a look at the condition of the Orthodox communities across the world prior to their arrival here in the United States. And this is very important because all of what went on in the hundreds of years before coming to America still resonates. That is still part of the embedded cultural, experiential life of the Orthodox, even here in this new land. The old land and the old world still speaks very powerfully in the memories and the lives and the ways in which Orthodoxy experiences even its planting here. I did start with this icon of North American saints, which is really quite extraordinary. The wonderful thing is that we already, even though we've really only been planted here in a very active and engaged way for about 100 years, at the most a couple of 100 years, we have already seen saints who have been lifted up and recognized in the life of the Orthodox Church, and there will be more soon, I am sure. So, but we are going to go back a little bit. You see some of the historical background that stands behind the coming to the new world of the Orthodox churches. So we know that a vast amount of the Orthodox world fell under the yoke of the Ottoman Empire. And this, of course, was an Islamic empire. There were other areas as well that fell under non-Ottoman, but still Islamic caliphates. The ones, of course, that we know of that are in Jerusalem and the ancient patriarchates of Antioch and of Alexandria. But then, of course, the great ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople, and also a number of other Orthodox lands, Serbia, Albania, Georgia. Many of these Orthodox countries came under the Ottoman rule, where Christianity no longer was the faith of the rulers. And a system prevailed under the Ottoman Empire that greatly affected the way Orthodoxy came to experience itself in this world. They used something called the millet system, which was a legal structure that separated the conquered peoples according to confessional community. And that became an ethno-religious community that was led by an ethnarch, a ruler who was identified as having both the ethnic and the religious identity of the people that he oversaw. This ethnarch then had to speak directly to the Ottoman rulers. So what you have now is the beginning of taking a land, a whole empire that basically had everybody together. All of the Orthodox were, operating together, and began separating them according to the ethno-cultural identities, and those remained intact because they had their own little, system of operation, their own political, they had their own courts, they had their own system of taxation. They were allowed certain restricted types of worship as a particular community, and that community had to then sort of connect with the Ottoman rulers. And there were two things that really came out of this system. First of all, the benefit was that it actually enabled the Orthodox communities to maintain themselves some kind of integrity and separateness from the general Islamic population, Turkish Islamic population, over several hundred periods, because basically they were forced to. They could move out of that system if they converted to Islam and left behind their faith. There were incentives to do that because when you were in the system, you were definitely a second-class citizen. There were a lot of oppressive measures for those people within those systems. But it did allow, it sort of protected these communities over time. They didn't just get absorbed into the general Ottoman Empire. But one of the great downsides is that you began to find ethnic walls built up. To be Greek was to be Orthodox was to be Greek, and it preserved your faith as well as your identity. And this is still very much carried with communities as they left the old world and came into the new world. That the faith was identified with the ethnic identity, and you couldn't leave one behind without leaving the other behind. The language, for example, is a primary way in which the community retained its identity over hundreds of years, but it's also a primary way in which the faith went forward from generation to generation. Okay, so the ethno-national identities of the various Orthodox communities remained active, although oppressed. Well, I don't want to give you the idea that there was just freedom here. There were many, many oppressive rules. We are not going to get into that. This is not about the church under Byzantine rule, only insofar as it continued to impact the church as it came to the New World. Okay. As these ethno-religious communities struggled and received and were able to obtain their independence from Ottoman rule in the 19th century, as they began to break away, this is when you begin to see the Orthodox churches of these various communities become firmly established. And these are when you begin to see the proliferation of the autocephalous Orthodox churches. Autocephaly meaning it has its own head. What does that mean? It means that you go up the hierarchical ladder and the last guy on the top and everybody underneath it is all within that community. They don't look to anybody else for direction, instruction, guidance, laws, rules, decisions, etc. It's all within their own structure. The Orthodox Church of Greece declared itself independent, autocephalous, its own family group. And think of these as families within the larger family. So, your brother John has his family, and your sister Susan has her family. And within that family structure, okay, they have, people who are in charge and make decisions, etc. And what Susan's family decides is not the same as what John's family decides. But think of these family groups as all sort of living in the same house and having ultimately the same values, beliefs, ways of living. And so they're very, very similar, but they have certain kinds of independent ways of doing things, sort of the different cultural expressions, as well as the different administrative programs, okay? Orthodox Church of Greece declared itself autocephalous in 1833. As I put in the slide, recognized 1850. What does that mean? It means that the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople did not officially recognize this church of Greece until 1850. So it took time, and this happened with several of these patriarchates, for the older, more established church, sort of what you would call the mother church, to recognize the daughter church. Especially if the daughter church is the one who said, I'm independent, all right? And the mother church is like, wait a minute, I didn't say you could go yet. And so the Patriarchate of Bulgaria, 1872 declared, it wasn't recognized until 1945. Patriarchate of Serbia, basically uncontested in 1879. Romania, 1865, and et cetera, et cetera. You see a couple of them that are still contested, the Orthodox Church in America, and we will talk about that. In 1970, it is still contested. It's autocephaly, and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which came into its autocephaly was granted by the Ecumenical Patriarch in 2018, and it is still contested, as is the autocephaly of the Macedonian Orthodox Church. All right, now we are going to start with how did Orthodoxy come here, and why does it look the way it does? There are actually two major pathways, fundamentally different. One is mission, and following the Russian explorers that came from the Northwest, okay, come from Russia, explorers, traders, people who were out to exploit the natural resources, came from Russia into the Alaskan territories and the far Northwest. And with them, or sort of on their heels, came Russian missionaries. So one way was missionizing, evangelizing the native peoples of the New World was how it came at one point. But what was the second avenue? Completely different. It came with the immigrants who brought their faith with them. Okay, they were already Orthodox and they're bringing it here to the New World. Okay. Initially, these two paths are independent. Stuff was happening on the far west and northwest of the US. They didn't know anything about the immigration that was going on in New York and Florida and New Orleans and Chicago. But over time, of course, what was going on in the West and what was going on in the East actually did meet. And then they had to figure out how these work together. Unfortunately, they never could do that quite well because there was massive historical upheavals that they had to then deal with, just as they were coming to establish some kind of cohesiveness between the immigrants from that were in the eastern part of the US and the missionary group that had started in the far west. All right. This is a map that kind of gives you an idea of what was going on where. Obviously, on the western coast of the US, this is where the Orthodox faith is being brought to the native peoples, beginning in 1794. 1794, far northwest Alaskan territories, came down ultimately into San Francisco, and then does move east. What's going on the East Coast, especially initially New York, Florida, and New Orleans. But there was an immense flux from 1880 to 1920. Really, something like half of Greece. Okay, I mean, I'm not really joking. It's just a huge number of people from Greece in particular, but also from a lot of the other ethnic Orthodox lands came flooding into the US. All right, a little bit about the missionary team. It began with 8 monks, including the very beloved Saint Herman of Alaska. And imagine this, they traveled 7,327 miles It took them 293 days from their monastery to the Alaskan territories, Kodiak Island. And a lot of that was on foot or by horse and cart. I mean, there was a little bit by treacherous ship, but it was a massive undertaking of tremendous commitment. They began to missionize the natives, but they also found that there was a lot of abuse by the Russian traders and merchants that were basically treating the native people as slaves, sometimes also abusing them in other ways. So some of the monks returned back to Russia to gain authority so that they can come back and actually exert control over the Russian commercial group. And in that process, one of the monks, Yosef Bolotov, had been consecrated as the first bishop to come back to the Alaskan territories, but he and all who accompanied him died on the trip back when their ship sank. So a few remained. St. Herman in particular had remained in Kodiak, and he lived in seclusion on Spruce Island. It was very beloved, and through those who remained, the initial missionary push was still retained, okay, like a little spark. And I will show you pictures in a minute. But, just go through the timeline. What happened after that, the extraordinary moments, if you will. In 1824, this phenomenal priest, Father John Veniaminoff, and his presbyter and his wife came to Alaska and began to missionize. And he learned the Aleutian language and he translated the materials into Aleut. And he would take his little canoe and just go from island to island in the bitter cold to baptize, to evangelize. After his wife died, he returned to Russia and he was consecrated as the first bishop to come back and actually, get there and be established. So he was consecrated in 1840 with the name Innocent. And he came back to the American territories, the Alaskan territories. They weren't part of America yet. He established a school. He helped to form the seminary, and he started to really develop this mission into a diocese. It wasn't quite a diocese yet, but it was getting there, okay? He consecrated the first cathedral in Sitka, Alaska. And then the first Russian parish, the first basically parish established in US territory was in 1868 in San Francisco, which is today the Holy Trinity Orthodox Church's, the Orthodox Church in America's cathedral in San Francisco. In 1868, Innocent goes back to Russia, and now he's consecrated as Metropolitan of Moscow. The Metropolitan of Moscow is, in fact, the highest position, so it is equivalent to his patriarch. I say that because at that point there was actually no patriarch in Russia. Due to Russian history, the patriarchate had been abolished for a couple hundred years. It didn't get reinstated until the eve of the Russian Revolution. So he wasn't technically patriarch, but he was the equivalent of patriarch. All right. We have the establishment of the first Orthodox diocese in the United States. It's in California and the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. It's in that area with Bishop John Metropolsky as the ruling hierarch. All right, a few pictures. St. Innocent of Alaska. As I said, he was first Father John Benyanimov, and then he became Innocent, and he has been recognized as a saint now. Here we have one of those native churches, early churches that was built on Seal Islands in Alaska. Here we have the headman of the Tlingits in Sitka, Alaska, with the Russian priest. Okay. And one of the very early churches that was built that looked like a church that we recognize as opposed to more of a native structure in Sitka, built around 1845, St. Michael's. We know that this here is that structure that has been expanded and become a cathedral in Sitka, Alaska by 1887. And we should note that by the time Alaska was sold to America, the Russian mission had grown. And remember, they came, well, like 80 years prior, okay? Those missionaries, those 8 missionaries, half of which died in shipwreck on the way back again. It had grown to 12,000 native Christians had been baptized and were active, 9 parishes, 35 chapels, 17 schools, and 4 orphanages. And here we see today what St. Michael's looked like. So this church here in the black and white is this church here in 2007 in color. All right, another Russian mission church in the interior. And here is a wedding party on St. Paul Island in 1898. A second pit. So this is just the beginnings of normally when Orthodoxy goes to a new country, it sends out missionaries. The people don't know about the Christian faith. It sends out missionaries, it converts them, it baptizes them. And the missionaries, they have hierarchs that guide them. So that's how the first path was. The missionaries, who were the hierarchs that guided them? The ones in Russia. So that first missionary pathway was Russian. But that's not the case of the ones that came through immigration, right? The second pathway. Now we know that there were more than 25 million came between 1870 and 1910. Of course, they weren't all Orthodox, but a great many Orthodox did come. And we have here a picture of them landing at Ellis Island. Many of us had grandparents that came that way. And this is a picture of the Church of the Holy Trinity, which was established in New Orleans as a Greek Orthodox parish, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. I just wanted to give you an idea of what these early immigrant communities look like. But let's think about what it meant for them to come here, because all of that actually impacts the way the church acts here. The way it's different from the way it was in the old world. The way our parishes grew, our parish councils grew, the way the laity became involved was all really due to the way the church arrived here through the immigrant process. Why? They came here and there was no diocese or archdiocese. There were no bishops, there were no priests. There were no buildings, there were no structures, there was nothing except the fervent faith and commitment of the immigrants. They brought their icons, they brought their faith, and then they started to build, right? They raised the money, they've purchased property, or sometimes they purchased existing structures for worship, and they started to build what they could, or began to meet in any kind of facility that would enable them to worship together. They wrote back to whatever home they considered home, begging for clergy. So the Greeks would write back to whatever Greek hierarch they were under. And so some were under the Church of Greece, some were under the ecumenical patriarch. The Serbs would write back to the Serbians, the Antiochians write back to their hierarchs in Syria or Lebanon or wherever they were from, right? But the clergy only came in little tiny droplets, right? In the meantime, they had to make decisions. So they organized parish councils and boards to be able to decide how to go forward. What do you do next? They began to organize church schools so that their children would be educated. They developed programs for ethnic language and identity so that their children that they're raising now in this new world would stay connected to their faith and to their identity in this mass of various different identities, right? They began to develop philanthropic groups to take care of all these new immigrants that were coming in. And one of those was the Philoptochos, the women's philanthropic group, to look at the needs of the hungry, the poor, the homeless, the refugees, these hungry, homeless people that are flooding in here, right? First, these charitable institutions looked towards the needs of their own communities, and there were many needs. But they also began to look beyond their own communities. And they also began to purchase land for cemeteries. So you see a lot of lay involvement. They did the bulk of the work. There were no priests. Priests started to come, but then they had to interact with the sort of the power structures that had already been established here. This was a new experience. This was not something you found in the old world. It's very American in many ways, right? So we have these two things going on. We have the Russian diocese that had been established in the far west and immigration in the east, but the Russian diocese is moving across the states to the east because they have immigrants coming in too. And in fact, this diocese that started in Alaska and the northwest of America begins to see itself as being the umbrella to care for all of the Orthodox communities. They envision multi-ethnic Orthodox parishes, right? Not just Russian, not just native peoples to America, but everybody who's Orthodox. They start in San Francisco, but they, in 1905, transfer the seat to New York. The primate is now no longer simply a bishop, he is now archbishop. And they begin to see themselves as permanently here and in many ways American. They commemorate the American president, right? And not the Russian czar during their services, starting in 1906. There's a shift. This is becoming an American diocese. By 1907, this group has celebrated the first All-American Sobor. It's like a clergy laity congress. It's a meeting of all of the communities. And the Russian Mission Church took the name of the Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church in America. So it really is a very, the mindset is that it is embracing all of the Orthodox and actually allowed laymen to participate in this council. Right, I know we started late, and I'm going to just keep moving on. We're not at 8 o'clock yet. So a couple of phenomenal people who are now recognized as saints enabled this community, this diocese, this structure to grow. Without getting into too much detail, Father Alexis Toth was known as a Eastern Rite Catholic. Eastern Rite Catholic are Catholics that were Catholic insofar that they recognize the Pope as their highest authority, but in every other way, they really act and look and are in many ways Orthodox. Their churches look Orthodox, their priests marry, etc. Don't have time to talk about why this community exists as it does. It is a terrible sore spot that Eastern Rite Catholics, for Orthodox, is a terrible sore spot that they're not Orthodox. And a point of contention between the Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. But when Father Alexis Toth came to America, he found the Catholic cardinals here unwilling to recognize the Eastern Rite qualities of the parishes. And so Father Alexis Toth led multiple parishes. It came to about 20,000 Eastern Rite Catholics from that position as being Eastern Rite Catholics into full Orthodoxy. All right, and he's recognized as a kind of missionary saint for this work. I say this because here we have all these different layers of stuff going on in America, unique to America. This is not happening anywhere else. Eastern Rite Catholics are not coming in droves in other places, but it happened here. Under the umbrella of this originally Russian diocese, and now it's envisioning itself as more multi-ethnic, they saw the need of Arabic-speaking Orthodox communities to have those who are, in fact, from within their community leading them. And so in 1904, our Commandant Raphael Havalini is consecrated as Bishop of Brooklyn in this Russian Greek Catholic Orthodox diocese. He is the first bishop consecrated in America, and it was with the purpose of serving the Syrian community within this one diocese. Now, remember, this is the only diocese that officially exists in America in the early 20th century. Right? Another saint that came to be very active and also was operating within this one diocese was Father Sebastian Davidic. He's Serbian. He was raised to the rank of Archimandrite. He was actually born in America of Serbian heritage. And so he is now recognized as an American-born Serbian American saint in San Francisco. So, as you see, multi-ethnic, right? Multi-ethnic. In 1905, as I said before, the seat of this diocese was transferred to New York, and the person who was presiding at that time was Archbishop Tikhon. Archbishop Tikhon later, a few years later, goes to Russia and is elevated to the position of Archbishop of Moscow, and then in 1918 is recognized as patriarch. He becomes the first patriarch of the restored patriarchate of Russia. And you know what happened? You know what happens in Russia? Russian Revolution. And Patriarch Tikhon, who was archbishop in America for many years, died as a confessor. He was basically imprisoned, tortured, abused, and he did die as a result of his injuries and suffering under the Soviets. But he is known as the Patriarch of Moscow and the Enlightener of North America. And he said something, I think, very telling. Back in 1905, all right, he had this vision, which is a vision that we are still struggling to meet today. He said the diocese is not only multinational, it is composed of several Orthodox, hang on a minute, I have to move that, churches, which keep the unity of the faith, but preserve their peculiarities in canonical structure and liturgical rules in parish life. So one church, but allowing each Orthodox community to still be itself, right? These peculiarities are dear to them and can perfectly well be tolerated in the pan-Orthodox scene. We do not consider that we have the right to suppress the national character of the churches here. On the contrary, we try to preserve this character and we confer on them the latitude to be governed by leaders of their own nationality. Life in the New World, he continued, is different from that in the Old. A greater autonomy and possibly autocephaly should be granted to the church in America. So back in 1905, he had the vision that someday the church in America could be an Orthodox church that has its own head in America that still speaks to the ethnic diversity and allows for all of that to be part of the life here. All right. So, water. All right. But you see in the beginning of the 20th century, the beginning of the jurisdictional divisions that plague us today. All right. They have their strengths in that, but there are problems as well. So what was going on? Well, yes, of course, there was this diocese, this vision of multi-ethnic parishes, but we don't even pretend to think that all the parishes were talking to each other. Communication was very poor, of course, in the early 20th century. A lot of what one community was doing was not even understood or known by other communities. What happens in New York wasn't known in Louisiana, is not understood or known by what was going on in Texas, etc. So you do have attempts to establish a broader structure in various locations by various Orthodox jurisdictions. In 1908, the Church of Constantinople, seeing that it had its hands tied, gave care for the Greek Orthodox parishes in the US to the Church of Greece. This is known as, they issued a tomos, a decree, that said that all of the Greeks that were under their care will now be under the Church of Greece. This changes a little later, but for about 12, 14 years, the ecumenical patriarchs stepped back. All right. And during this period of time, you see churches getting established in multiple places. Between 1890 and 1910, about 300,000 Greeks arrived. And then after that, for the next decade after that, another 300,000. So we are talking about huge numbers. The first Greek Orthodox parish in New York was established in 1892. And then two, Annunciation and Holy Trinity, were established in Chicago in the 1890s. And then you see other Orthodox communities establishing their first parishes that are consciously now under an old world patriarch or hierarch to guide them. But the politics of the world, the catastrophes of world war and revolution tremendously impact the way the churches are able to grow here. The most devastating to the establishment of a single jurisdiction and identity and diocese is the Russian Revolution. In between 1917 and 1923, of course, the church in Russia itself was thrown into chaos. Communication with the Orthodox here that were under their direction is severely compromised, to the point which in 1924, if you go down to some of these other points, 1921, some of the churches of Russia outside of Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, today known as Rokor, met in a synod and broke from Moscow. In 1924, a group known as the Metropolia, and that is the same as the Russian Orthodox Mission Church that was here, okay? So the church, the Russian diocese that was here, voted to establish itself as temporarily self-governing in 1924, breaking ties with Moscow. These breaks were initially blessed by Patriarch Tikhon, but subsequently the metropolitans of Moscow took that back. And so for decades, many decades, the Russian communities here were not in communion with Moscow, with the church in Russia. Ties were broken. But there's chaos here, and the other Orthodox communities are looking around and saying, we're really not going to be safe under that diocese that's itself in turmoil and has a questionable status now. It's broken communion with its patriarch, with its hierarch, and, you know, is it legitimate? Well, we're going to go with our patriarch. We're going to go with our hierarchs. And so you see the establishment of the other jurisdictions under their old world hierarchs during this period of time. There's also World War I going on, all right? World War I is going to have some real impact on the Greeks. I'm going to actually go to a different slide for that. But just to see the sort of like boom, boom, boom. 1922, founding of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. 1926, the founding of the Serbian Orthodox Diocese of America. 1928, the Ukrainian Orthodox Diocese of America. 1929, Romanian Orthodox Episcopate, kind of similar, is established. And actually, it just keeps going. Let's talk a little bit about the Greeks, because this is a Greek Orthodox parish. And so it behooves us to say a little bit about our own history here. The first Greeks that we have recorded coming to the New World here arrived in Florida as indentured servants. There are about 200. They did not fare well. Many of them died. Disease, starvation. It was very terrible. No communities came about from that. A few of the Greeks from that community went to St. Augustine. You all might know that St. Augustine is still a very Greek place down in Florida. But you do have import-export merchants setting up in New Orleans. And in 1967, the Greeks who had settled there established the first Greek Orthodox parish, but they did conceive of themselves as multi-ethnic. I talked about the mass immigration. We talked about the Tomos of 1908, where the people in America went under the Holy Synod of Greece. But something happened in World War I. In World War I, the King of Greece, Constantine, his wife was German, and so they wanted to remain neutral. So the royalist party in Greece was neutral. But the political leader, Venizelos, wanted Greece to align with the Allies. And there was a huge division, and that bled into the US, and parishes started to argue. They separated, they locked the doors on each other. They, it just continued to be turmoil after turmoil. One of the metropolitans of Athens was a royalist, and he got basically deposed or set aside, and a Venizelos metropolitan by the name of Metaxakis becomes the metropolitan of Athens. And why is he important? He comes to the US, and he is the one who established the Greek Orthodox diocese. He is the one who convened the first clergy laity congress of the Greek Orthodox here in 1921 and 1922. And then guess what? He became ecumenical patriarch. And he reversed the tomos of the other ecumenical patriarch. He says, no, these Greeks in America, they're under the ecumenical patriarch, him, now. And so ever since then, the Greeks in America are under the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople. And the Archdiocese of North and South America was officially founded. Today it's only called Archdiocese of North America. South America is its own archdiocese now. More about the Greeks. Just because they established the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese doesn't mean everybody who's Greek is going to agree to it. And so the division continued for about another 2 decades. Something else happened. And this is something, again, we need to keep to our consciousness here in America. But something else that happened is in 1924, the ecumenical patriarch and the Church of Greece and some of the patriarchs, Alexandria, Antioch, decided to move to what we call the Gregorian or the new calendar. The Greeks that were royalists, that were opposing Metaxakis, they stayed old calendar, Julian calendar. So did Russia, and so did Serbia, and so did a couple other, Jerusalem, Mount Athos. So then you have a division, not just royalist Venizelos, but old calendar, new calendars. And we still have not churches within the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese who are old calendar, but it is still a point of friction among Orthodox communities. Old calendar being 13 days behind the new calendar. So for example, the Feast of St. Nicholas, which we just celebrated yesterday on December 6th, the old calendar communities will celebrate it in 13 days, which is January 19th. Happens with Christmas, happens with everything, but not Easter. I will not get into calendar unless you ask me specific questions in the question and answer period, right? It's too complicated and we won't make our way through. All right, it's almost 8:15. Let me just finish this quickly, this slide, and then we're going to take a short break. As I said, this division within the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese continued for a couple of decades, but the person who is most responsible for bringing the church back to unity, bringing these, dissident parishes back into the fold is the great, many people think, Athenagoras. Athenagoras started out as the Archbishop of North and South America, and then he was elected to ecumenical patriarchate. So he became the ecumenical patriarch in 1949 under his tenure, and then the one who followed him, Michael. Most of the communities of the Greek Orthodox came back together as one community. Now, without going through all of the other ethnic churches, I want to tell you the Serbs were divided over various political things, and they finally came back together. Really not until the end of the 20th century. Well, maybe the 80s, yeah, about the 80s. The Ukrainians, the Russians were splintered into 4 groups, 2 prominently here in the US. So what you see with the Greeks was repeated in its own way in all of these jurisdictions. I say that because as much as you see the divisions and the problems, it was fueled by a lot of history, and that was not within the control of the Orthodox Church. And it was very hard for the communities to sort of manage their historical political realities along with trying to establish themselves here in the church as churches in the US. All right, we're going to take a brief break. Let's give ourselves 5 minutes just to kind of regroup, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Okay? All right. George, should I leave the PowerPoint up? Okay. Okay. I'm going to just sit down.
I want to go over the definition and now start with the Russian language. And I think you'll see that this one presence. And we have a much more analyzed approach.
There would have been some variation at the end of I think we were moving on.
Have you ever attended a no one spoke about this before, but my father was a long-time person here, served on the parish council. He retired and moved down to southern Indiana, just across the river Louisville. Was an OC church that was St. Michael's, founded by 2 families, one Russian and Serbian, but became just an incredible magnet for all Orthodox from all cultural backgrounds. And so I first went up to them and they was going to church, very involved, very much to priest. He did a lot of things for them anyway. I got to tell you, I was really amazed. So imagine the great entrance. Okay? And it is spoken in 6 different languages. And you see the various traditions, which Syria is a lot of Middle Eastern based Orthodox practice, kneeling before the chalice. As the prayers are being read, the priest touches the base of the chalice to their back. So it's very, very touching to hear it start in English, transfer to Greek, go to Syrian, Russian, and then they're making their way over. They stop and read the prayers. All those falling asleep underneath the dome. And then they continue again in whatever languages are represented. Comparison, they finish it as they come. That's, I mean, it's very long, but it's very good. The whole time people are singing in English, and certain petitions are uttered in other languages. Everyone was in English. Ethiopians were there. Their heads covered with one cloth. It's just like, it's just really what you need. It is a cross section of our society. All those words and what he does. I really was quite blessed to be a part of that church. Yes, I know. Letting everybody know. I'll give you a keynote.
Well, we got started late. That's why we have to have a brief break.
Okay, so I'm going to be coming back to you in just moments.
Okay.
Countdown 3, 2, 1.
Okay. All right. Welcome back, y'all. Good to have you back. I know it was a brief break, but hopefully enough to get ourselves reinvigorated. A lot of history that we've been plowing through, but we are going to be moving a little bit more to trying to understand the way in which the church can be today in America. We're not quite there yet, though. There's a little more history to deal with. Okay. Hang on. All right. So, church in the beginning of the 30s, you can say, goes through a period of consolidation and expansion. Consolidation meaning that each of the newly founded jurisdictional archdioceses are beginning to organize and identify where their people are, their parishes, set up programs, etc. But expand in the sense of really understanding themselves as permanently here and wanting to grow. As I mentioned, Athenagoras became Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox in 1931, elevated to Patriarch of Constantinople by 1948. And then the Russians, let me talk to you just a second about the Russians, okay? What was happening here. After the Russian Revolution, the Russians outside of Russia really splintered into 4 groups, 2 of which were prominently active in the United States. The group known as the Metropolia, which ultimately that was a group that started as the Russian Orthodox Missionary Diocese, became the Metropolia. I know it's an odd name, but we're not going to be able to go back and understand the genesis of that name. But ultimately, they become the OCA, or the Orthodox Church in America. In a slide or 2 ahead, we'll see that. Then there was the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. And they organized themselves as having a different, interrelationship with the Moscow Patriarch. They really broke more decisively away. And they did not reconcile with Moscow until much later than the other group that became known as the OCA. And there were still a very, very small number, I think there was just 1 or 2 parishes here that were directly under the Moscow Patriarch that continued that connection. So those were the 3 that were active here. There was a 4th group, but that was only active in Europe. So, and they were under the Ecumenical Patriarch. They were Russian immigrants under the emigres. People had fled Russia under the Ecumenical Patriarch. So those 2 Russian Orthodox communities established themselves here and grew, and they were not in communion with each other. Okay. The one that is probably most well-known and prominent in the earlier part of the 20th century was the group known as the Metropolia and became the OCA. And they're the ones that founded St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary and St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary in 1938. In 1937, a year before that, Holy Cross, Greek Orthodox School of Theology, is founded. Why is this important? It is essential that we have schools to train priests who are here in the US, native here, okay, native born or certainly being trained here and going out to serve parishes, no longer writing back home saying, please send us priests, who have really no understanding of the world and the life here. These are people who were born here, or if they weren't born here, they've lived here and they've certainly been educated here. However, let's not pretend that in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, the Orthodox communities are separated from their mother churches. They're certainly here growing, but they're very much connected and impacted by all of the turmoil and changes that come with the Depression in the 30s and then World War II, right? And all of the disruption that happened across all of those territories in the old world. Here are some photos of the establishment of these really phenomenal schools, which are still very beloved. Hellenic College Holy Cross, which is where I did my master's of divinity. And here is St. Vladimir's, and here's St. Tikhon's Orthodox Seminary. Okay. So now what we have is essentially a specific mindset that is being established, which becomes known as diaspora. Now, diaspora is not something that the Americans themselves, the Orthodox in America, used for themselves. This is how the mother churches referred to the Orthodox in the New World. And it harkens back to the condition of the Jews that had been dispersed out of Israel into the neighboring countries, and were seen as essentially, strangers in a strange land, not in their rightful home, but exercising their faith in foreign lands. And that idea of the diaspora, who have to maintain their faith in this foreign territory, sort of as an island of the home world of Israel, the island of Israel that is in, Germany or whatever. This mentality came to be the predominant way in which Orthodox were talked about and understood by the Old World Orthodox churches, which were known as the mother churches. And the churches here, their various jurisdictional bodies. The Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America is the daughter community of the Ecumenical Patriarch, right? And we were known as the Diaspora, a community dispersed from the motherland. This is a bit of a problem in trying to understand a community as organically belonging to this new world. If you are repeatedly described as a diaspora and understand yourself that way, can you really be American? Or are you a Greek transplanted in America and still maintaining that Greek identity in this new world? But still, you know, you aren't really authentically yourself until you're in your homeworld. As the church becomes more established here, as children are born here who are 100% American in terms of their cultural identity, well, 100%. You know, being American means that you're also ethnic. And you love being the ethnic identity that you are, and Americans celebrate that. That's part of what it means to be American, that you can also be Greek and you can be happy to be both. But, you know, I would tell people, you know, my children celebrate the 4th of July as the Day of Independence, not March 25th, because they were born here as Americans and they identify with this country and this reality. And that's fine as Orthodox. So the question is, how does diaspora speak to that shift in identity? And needless to say, the churches are also welcoming in people for whom none of the old world ethnicities are pertinent. They mean nothing whatsoever. They have no connection to those. And so how do you experience yourself as a diaspora church if you have people whose ancestry, you know, was here in America for 400 years, or before that was England, and, you know, well, 400, you know, several hundred years, okay. Very few that connected to America, but okay. I think you get what I mean. All right. This comes from the writing of a man who surveys Orthodoxy. He surveyed the Orthodox churches for the canonical bishops of the Orthodox Church to come to some sort of understanding of our condition in the US. And he said, consequently, instead of being a church serving the American people, the purpose of each Orthodox jurisdiction, at least for many decades in the 20th century, was to care for its people. Their parishes have become the centers not only of a religious, but also a social life. Firstly, they have served to attract and to consolidate in certain geographic areas the newly arriving immigrants. That's not bad. It's actually very, very helpful, a crucial task. And indeed, they went beyond just providing for religious education. They were concerned about financial aid, housing, enabling them to get jobs, that sort of thing. And you do see that as part of the life of the Orthodox communities in the 20th century. But side by side with social assistance intended to help the newcomers to begin a new life, you saw, and you do see to some extent, a high priority to the preservation of the ethnic culture and identity among their members. Remember, these are people who sustained their Orthodox faith for 500 years under Ottoman rule, from 1453 to really, I mean, my grandparents came from Turkey. They came from, my grandparents were born under Ottoman rule before it actually shifted to the Turkish state. But so they were born in Constantinople, when it was literally actually still called Constantinople, not Istanbul. And so what you see is that sense that you have to keep the faith preserved through the ethnic identity and the language, or else it's just going to be, drained away into the common culture, there's many incentives to do that. You'd be much more accepted. You have, more political power, whatever, if you're not Orthodox. So how do you keep that? So this idea of this high preservation of the ethnic identity and culture had value, but it came to, fight with the multi-ethnic and actually non-ethnic kind of parishes that could have been developed and that were initially being developed before the Russian Revolution hit and the two world wars. So this entwining of ethnic and religious identity that had served the Orthodox Church so well, right? In the new world, in their new home, had some unforeseen consequences. Resistance to ecclesiastical and administrative unity. The idea that the Orthodox could be one church and work together and do stuff together was not even really on board for a long time. It did finally gradually change, and we'll talk about that. No concern for mission, very little concern for mission. It was inward looking, not looking out to the greater population in America, right? Not that much concern for the wider society in terms of philanthropy. And of course, this strong attachment to language for worship and education. All right. However, in the second half of the 20th century, you do begin to see Orthodoxy begin to experience a transition, and an actual American Orthodoxy, whatever that is going to finally look like, begin to emerge. Part of that, that drove that, were some extraordinary people and events and actions undertaken and joint programs that were established. One of the individuals I want to lift up was Archbishop Jacobus, who became Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in 1959 until 1996. And he was an extraordinary leader who really spoke to the wider community. You'll see a photo that definitely talks to that in a minute. All right. In 1960, the Orthodox bishops decided they had to start speaking to each other and work together for common goals. And so the first is called SCOBA. It's called the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the Americas was established. That has now transitioned to something called the Assembly of Bishops of America. In 1965, as early as 1965, this group, the Standing Conference of Canonical Bishops, appealed to their mother churches to allow the first steps towards American Orthodox unity. That sort of just got stuck in the mud for decades. But I will say, in the beginning of the 21st century, the mother churches have said, well, you can start talking about that now. Orthodox unity. Ultimately, maybe jurisdictional unity. One American Orthodox Church. You can start talking about it. They're starting to talk about it. But you also see the beginning of the North American Catholic Theological Consultation from 1965. we have been talking with the Roman Catholics. Actually, some phenomenal decisions have come through. Don't hear about that much, but they have been actively talking to each other. In that same year, Archbishop Jacobus very famously marched with Dr. Martin Luther King in the Selma to Montgomery marches. During all this, though, you still have more immigration coming because after World War II, upheavals, people left their old world countries, not only the Greeks, but then you also have from many of the Baltic countries, and then you have the countries in the Middle East. All right, so what do we have here? I have in the lower right-hand corner, this is a picture of Scott in the very first gathering of the canonical bishops. Up in the left, you see Jacobus marching with Martin Luther King Jr. My husband still has his copy of this Life magazine. It was an extraordinary moment. And Orthodox are beginning to move into the public square, to see themselves as having a voice in America and its decisions and its future and its politics and its the way it is going to go forth. And here you have Orthodox participating in the Walk for Life, Orthodox Christians for Life, to protect the unborn, and also, of course, the elderly, who are or the infirm, etc. All life is sacred. In 1970, that group that I told you about, the Russian Metropolia, reconciles with the Patriarch of Moscow, and they take the name Orthodox Church in America. Unfortunately, not all, some of the autocephalous churches have recognized them, but not all. The Ecumenical Patriarch has still not officially recognized the OCA. And that has to do with the way in which the Ecumenical Patriarch understands how autocephaly is granted, and who can do that under what circumstances. So that's a case of the hierarchs kind of arguing with each other, all right? Nevertheless, even though the canonical status of the OCA, Orthodox Church in America, is a little fuzzy, we consider ourselves, we Greeks, we Antiochians, we Serbs, we Russians, all consider ourselves one Orthodox church in terms of doctrine and sacramental life and common faith. And that is not under dispute. What is under dispute is who recognizes authority to make decisions about granting independence and that sort of thing. So during this latter few decades of the 20th century, you do begin to see the Orthodox moving out into American life. And here you see the establishment of multiple pan-Orthodox associations or programs that move beyond the looking inward, sort of taking care of our own steps, to addressing the Orthodox, Americans broadly speaking, and indeed globally. So what do we see? In 1965, and then it fizzled and had to get re-established. Orthodox Christian Fellowship, OCF, is a program for college students, not just Orthodox, but anyone interested in Orthodoxy, speaking to young people on campuses, right? 1985, the founding of the Orthodox Christian Mission Center to promote Orthodoxy, Orthodox missionary activity worldwide. It's a tremendous group that has done a huge amount of work in Africa, Albania, and the Alaskan areas, and other places, Mexico. I'm going to skip 1987 for a minute, come back to it. In 1992, we find the founding of IOCC, the International Orthodox Christian Charities. Again, a phenomenal group that has really understood its charity as global, not just reaching to Orthodox people, but to all peoples in need as much as it can. We see a few other things moving into American life. I'll go back to the one in 1987. In 1987, a group that had on its own, they were Protestants involved in Campus Crusade and some very non-traditional, Christian worship, had decided they were going to find the original authentic church. And they started studying, and they came to realize that it's the Orthodox Church. And as a group of about 2,000, they petitioned and were received into the Antiochian Orthodox Church. And their members, especially the people who were their leaders, eventually many of them became ordained priests and a couple of bishops, and really worked in phenomenal ways to grow the church in America under the Antiochian Archdiocese. In 1994, the bishops decided to get together and meet and start talking about Orthodox unity, and really challenged the idea of diaspora. They made the claim, we are not a diaspora church anymore. Cannot think of us that way. We began to really challenge that idea. And in 2010, SCOBA basically became the Episcopal Assembly of North and Central America. Now it's called the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops, or Assembly of Bishops, and have been tasked with the mother churches to begin the path towards unity. Some pictures. On the one side, you see the International Orthodox Christian Charities programs, feeding the hungry, providing clothing and blankets and towels. And then you see the missions with baptisms of new members. Theological societies and other societies were established. The OTSA, the Orthodox Theological Society of America. OCAMPER, the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. These are associations of people with advanced degrees and resources who are all Orthodox or pan-Orthodox, and they meet yearly, and they advance many programs to further the progress of Orthodoxy in America. Other groups, the Orthodox Christian Prison Ministry, Eastern Orthodox Commission on Scouting. There's the Orthodox Christian Education Commission. We have Orthodox Christian Network providing internet and different blogs and audio programs. I should also mention Ancient Faith Radio does the same. Zoe for Life, that fights for the sanctity of life, the Orthodox Peace Fellowship, and then caring for the homeless, the poor, and the orphans through Project Mexico and the St. Innocent Orphanage. So these are ways the church can look toward a new presence here in America that is more pan-Orthodox, that is more reaching out to the various communities, that is doing the work of Christ, that is following his great commission to evangelize. And I do want to highlight that here at St. Peter and Paul, our church here in Glenview, a couple years ago, we hosted the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine psychology, and religion. And in fact, at the same time, we hosted the Orthodox Theological Association. This picture is actually from a different meeting, but this one meeting hosted both associations. So the St. Peter and Paul is thick in the midst of it, okay? Orthodox prison ministry. Of course, our own Deacon Ted is involved with that. Project Mexico. We've had many people, many young people go through Project Mexico from St. Peter and Paul, and also parishes throughout the U.S. And here's our own Deacon Ted speaking at the Ocamper meeting in 2019. So anyway. And I'm a member of Road Summit. Okay, so how do we go from this multi-jurisdictional archdiocesan of Serbia and Greece and Bulgaria and Ukraine and whatever, all these different jurisdictions who kind of are talking to each other now, but still are very, very sort of on their own and doing their own thing. How do we get past that to become this one church? And again, remembering the vision of St. Tikhon when he was Archbishop in America, who said, you know, we're not talking about erasing the beautiful, he called them peculiarities, but the ways in which each community incarnates and experiences orthodoxy, but we're talking about doing it under one umbrella where we all talk to each other and work together and we are in harmony. We're not fighting each other or competing with each other, right? Where we work together. It's difficult. It's very difficult to imagine how we will get there. But of course, God's grace protects and guides his church. It's not just humans doing this. It's God's Holy Spirit. What are some of our challenges? Today, the Orthodox world is suffering under a schism between Moscow and Constantinople, the patriarchs of Moscow and Constantinople. Moscow has refused to share communion with Constantinople. Constantinople will share communion with Moscow, but Moscow refuses over the Ukraine, over autocephaly granted by the ecumenical patriarch to Ukraine in 2018, and that is unresolved. And there are politics. Don't think there aren't politics involved. There are politics involved. Even as we move toward administrative unity, we have to maintain respect for and care of the mother churches. Many of the mother churches are in compromised situations where they cannot survive completely cut off from their communities in the US. And so they can't let go because in some ways they require that financial support, that voice that stands up for them. Okay, the patriarchates in Jerusalem and in Antioch and Alexandria, and of course in Constantinople, they have nothing to defend them in their own lands. So the communities, even as they gain their own independence elsewhere, need to continue this support, communication, deep connection to the mother churches. I mentioned how important it is to each Orthodox jurisdiction that even as we enter into a time of unity, we still maintain our identities, okay? And let's remember, this is a model that is inherent to the Trinity itself, that we have unity and yet distinct persons, okay? And the gift of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost was, yes, a church that is one, but multiple languages, right? So diversity and unity is something that is part of the very identity of the Christian church. And so that should never be obliterated. We're not talking about erasing these identities, okay? But enabling unity to also flourish and not to stress one more than the other. We have to resolve somehow our differences in calendar, financial resources, just the numbers are vastly different between one jurisdiction and the other. We call, say, the Greeks are the elephant in the room. There's just a lot more of us, and that can be overwhelming to communities that don't have many in terms of numbers. So when you talk about unity, will the 10 Serbian families be swallowed up in the 50 Greek? And what about the 5 that have no ethnic identity? How do you manage this so that everybody feels equally heard and valued and have a chance for their own expression? These are definitely challenges. Challenges of deciding which bishop is going to be in charge of the area, or how do you work that out? Right now we have several bishops. We have a Greek metropolitan, but there's an OCA archbishop, and there's a Serbian bishop. And how do you manage this territory that has all these different hierarchs all managing the same territory, more or less? How do you organize it? So these are things that the Assembly of Bishops are trying to untangle. But I just want to point out that there are challenges for the Orthodox going forward in America. What would be the benefits? We can share resources because we are very much strung to the limit, and our theological schools are suffering tremendously. They're financially in terrible woes. Okay, working together can really help to share our resources. We can speak with one voice. We will be more credible to the American world if people look at us and don't see like a family of sisters and brothers squabbling, but actually working together. And honestly, there are people who are like, well, I want to be Orthodox, but which one do I choose? Does it matter? How does that work? It's very confusing. It would finally restore us to proper canonical status, because you're supposed to only have one Orthodox administrative body in one territory. You're not supposed to have multiple. It's against the canons, actually. It will enable our mission to go forward in terms of converting the world to Christ. If we are seen to be a place of peace and reconciliation and unity, it becomes, we have a voice then that can go out to the world more effectively. And indeed, one of the benefits would be that we can have the church become authentically American, expressing the language and culture of the world of the place in which, the land in which we live, and our children are being brought up. So to conclude, I included photos of real actual parishes that are very diverse. Now, this is not the most diverse, but it shows a great variety of ages, and Indeed, actually, I know this parish has people from many different ethnic backgrounds. But here we have some photos that show more of what we would call visual diversity, because there are Black people as well as white people, and people, we have some people who are Asian, and by the way, we definitely include people from, native populations and various lands and countries, and there are people from India and people from Brazil and people just wherever. Orthodoxy is everywhere. Orthodoxy is the faith of Christ. And so our communities here in America can reflect that because we as Americans are people from all over the world. So this one is particularly a Romanian Orthodox church. And the other one is in Maryland, an OCA church. So I think that comes to the end of the PowerPoint, which is pretty fortuitous since we are 8:59. But I am going to take some questions. We did get started late. I realize that there might be more questions, and I'm happy to stay on to answer any questions that come up. So I do want to actually apologize to the gentleman who's sitting here in the pew, because I tended to look mostly at the camera and not at you, but it's just simply the way the thing is set up. But, okay, and I really appreciate we had one person show up in person. All right, guys. Do I see any questions? And for that, I would say unmute and ask your question or put it in the chat. Are there questions from previous classes? Because I'm willing to handle that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So the question, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Jake. Jake asked a question. Given all of these different jurisdictions under different hierarchs, you asked whether the various services are being doctrines and sacraments and things like that. So, although some of the sacraments might look a little different, doctrinally and in terms of really everything that is fundamental in that sacrament is the same across all of the jurisdictions. So that I can receive the Holy Sacraments in the Serbian church, and a Romanian can receive the Holy Sacraments here, and we'll see things very similar. Now, there are slight regional, we call them incarnational differences that I say incarnational because the way in which the faith came to be lived and expressed takes on its color from the land. So, for example, you'll hear the music will sound different. The Greeks use Byzantine chant. So do the Antiochians, but a little bit different, okay? The Serbs, it's a modified Byzantine chant. But you go to the Russians in the OCA, now it is a very westernized musical scale, and they use a choir of voices instead of just simple chanting. And of course, we have choirs in the GOA here, but that is actually a sort of an import from the West. It's not strictly traditional to the Greek manifestation. you can say it's a sort of American Orthodox expression. So the music might change, but does the process of the liturgy change? For the most part, no, but there are a couple of little things that you'll see that are in one liturgy that are not in the other, in terms of the way it's celebrated. In terms of the way it's written, it's there, but for example, we in the GOA do not sing the Beatitudes, but they are sung or chanted in the OCA during the Divine Liturgy. It's not improper, it's part of the thing, but it's not necessary either. So there's a few little differences. In terms of the sacramental, anything that's important with regard to the sacrament, that's all present. We can all go to each other's seminaries and learn the same doctrinal teachings. We read the same books pretty much. We follow the same church fathers. Okay, so I teach at a Serbian seminary. I mean, these are young men who are going to be priests in the Serbian Archdiocese, and I'm Greek. The worst part of that is that they're old calendar and I'm new calendar, so they're still in, I'm in Advent before they are, and they haven't had Christmas when I have, that can be really problematic. But in terms of worship and faith and doctrine, we're all the same. So the calendar is, I think, the hardest problem to deal with. So, okay, other questions? Do I see? Okay, has anybody explained calendar to you guys? I don't want to belabor anything that, and if it's not something you don't want to talk about, I won't. If anybody wants to ask about it, I'll answer it. If not, if you could, we'll just let it be. Okay. But, all right. Other questions from previous classes that didn't get resolved? I'm game for anything. All right. Okay, well, then I will say it's been a pleasure to be able to share with you. I thank you for your patience in the beginning of this class being a little bit having unexpected delays, but all is well, and I wish you well, a beautiful, blessed Advent, and of course, a most holy and beautiful, blessed Christmas. So, all right. Take care, guys.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Helen.
Right? George? Okay. All right, bye, guys.